Elena adjusted the last dish on the dining table, stepping back to make sure everything was in place. A warm glow from the pendant lights cast soft shadows over the meal she had spent hours preparing. Everything was perfect, or at least it should have been. She smoothed the front of her dress, exhaling deeply as she heard the front door open. Her husband, Daniel, had called just an hour ago, telling her he was bringing his boss over for dinner, unexpectedly. She hadn't argued. She never did. But something about this night felt different. She turned, forcing a polite smile as Daniel stepped in first, his tie slightly loosened, a bright but nervous look in his eyes. Behind him, Mr. Carter followed, tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding an air of control that made the space feel smaller the moment he entered. His dark eyes scanned the room, lingering just a second too long when they landed on her. "Mr. Carter, this is my wife, Elena," Daniel said eagerly, stepping aside. Mr. Carter smiled, extending a hand. "Pleasure to finally meet you, Elena. Daniel talks about you all the time." She placed her hand in his, expecting a brief handshake, but his grip was firm, too firm. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, slow and deliberate, before he finally let go. A shiver crawled up her spine. She pulled her hand back and stepped aside. "Please, make yourself comfortable. Dinner is ready." They moved to the table, Daniel pouring drinks with an eager smile, too focused on pleasing his boss to notice the way Carter's gaze flickered toward Eleanor whenever he thought she wasn't looking. The conversation started light, work talk, casual laughs, but every now and then Mr. Carter would cut her off when she tried to speak, redirecting the conversation effortlessly back to himself or Daniel. "You must be incredibly proud of Daniel," he said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "He's been working so hard to get ahead. I mean, the late nights, the sacrifices. Must be tough on you, no?" Elena forced a smile. "We manage," Carter smirked, eyes gleaming as he leaned in slightly. "You're a very patient woman." His voice had a weight to it, something hidden beneath the words. She swallowed, glancing at Daniel, but he was too busy topping up Carter's drink to notice the way his boss was looking at her. The first touch was subtle, too subtle for Daniel to see. When she reached for the breadbasket, Carter did too, letting his fingers brush against hers. The contact sent a sharp jolt through her, and she pulled back immediately, but he didn't. Instead, he acted as if nothing had happened, carrying on with the conversation. She tried to ignore it. Maybe it had been an accident, but then it happened again. When she set down a dish in front of him, his fingers grazed the small of her back, a touch so light, yet so intentional, that she nearly dropped the plate. "Careful," he murmured, smirking. Elena's throat tightened. She glanced at Daniel again, but he was laughing at something, oblivious. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Maybe if she kept her distance, if she avoided standing too close, this night would pass without anything more. But Carter was relentless. "You know," he said, turning to Daniel, his voice dripping with amusement, "I have to say, your wife is absolutely stunning. You're a lucky man." Eleanor stiffened. Daniel chuckled, brushing it off. "Yeah, she keeps me in line." Carter smiled, but he wasn't looking at Daniel. He was looking at her. She must... The words hung in the air, thick with something unspoken. Eleanor forced herself to keep eating, but her hands trembled slightly under the table. The drinks kept flowing, Carter's speech getting looser, his eyes bolder. By the time they finished dinner, Daniel had fully fallen into the trap of admiration, laughing too hard at Carter's jokes, nodding eagerly at every word. Elena stood to clear the table, eager to escape the tension twisting in her stomach. She picked up a plate, turning toward the kitchen, but before she could take a step, Carter placed his hand over hers, stopping her. "Let me help you," he said. His fingers pressed against hers, warm and firm. Elena's breath hitched. "No need," she said quickly, pulling her hand back. "I've got it." Carter didn't move immediately. His gaze lingered, studying her, as if daring her to say something more. Then, with a slow, knowing smile, he leaned back in his chair, sipping his drink. Elena turned sharply, walking into the kitchen, her pulse racing. She set the plates down with more force than necessary, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady her breathing. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. She closed her eyes for a second, trying to shake the feeling of his touch still lingering on her skin. But before she could regain control, she heard footsteps behind her. "Let me give you a hand," Carter's voice came from the doorway. Her entire body tensed. She turned slowly, forcing her face into an, "I said I've got it!" Carter stepped closer, just enough that the air between them felt thick and suffocating. "You don't have to be so tense," he murmured, voice dropping just enough that Daniel wouldn't hear from the other room. "I'm just being polite." "Then be polite and step back," Elena said, her voice steady despite the way her heart pounded. Carter chuckled, tilting his head slightly. "Feisty. I like that." Her stomach churned. Before she could respond, Daniel's voice called from the dining room. "Carter, another drink." Carter smiled at her, slow and taunting. "Duty calls." He turned, strolling back into the dining room as if nothing had happened. Elena exhaled, gripping the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. She had never felt this kind of helplessness in her own home before. She took another deep breath, forcing herself to pull it together. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was Carter. Eleanor clenched the counter's edge, trying to steady her hands. The kitchen, her usual place of comfort, felt foreign, like a stage where she was trapped in a silent performance, forced to act as if nothing was wrong. The scent of roasted garlic and wine lingered in the air, but all she could smell was Carter's cologne, heavy and suffocating. Her pulse still throbbed from his last touch, the way his fingers had pressed against the small of her back, barely there yet unmistakably intrusive. She had brushed it off, pretended it hadn't happened, but he knew. He knew she had felt it, and that was what made it worse. She took a deep breath, grabbing the plates and moving toward the dining room again, reminding herself that the night would be over soon. She just had to get through it. But Mr. Carter was patient, and predators like him thrived on patience. As she stepped back into the dining room, she could hear Daniel laughing, his voice relaxed, as if the whiskey in his glass had melted away any tension. Carter sat across from him, his body lazy, loose, but his eyes sharp, always watching. "There she is," Carter murmured, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. Elena ignored him, setting down the plates, careful to keep her distance, but he didn't make it easy. When she moved past him to place the silverware, he shifted just slightly, but enough that his knee brushed against hers under the table. It could have been an accident, should have been an accident, but the way his eyes met hers, challenging, testing, told her otherwise. She pulled back instinctively, but he didn't move. "You've really outdone yourself," Carter said, taking a slow sip from his glass. "A woman like you must be hard to find." Daniel grinned, oblivious. "She's the best." Elena forced a smile, but inside she was screaming. Carter smirked. "I bet." His gaze lingered too long, too deep, and Elena felt as though he had stripped her down without ever lifting a finger. She needed to escape. "I should get dessert," she murmured, stepping away. Carter didn't stop her this time. But as she passed, she could hear him exhale a quiet chuckle, as if he was enjoying this, a game only he understood the rules to. She reached the kitchen, inhaling sharply. She had never felt so out of control in her own home before. Her hands trembled as she picked up the tray of dessert. She wasn't sure how much more of this she could take. The next opportunity came when Daniel stepped out to take a phone call, laughing at something as he disappeared down the hall. Eleanor felt the shift before it happened. The moment Daniel was gone, Carter stood slow and deliberate, stretching as if shaking off the night's fatigue. Then, without a word, he followed her into the kitchen. Her heartbeat quickened. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, felt the presence of him before he spoke. She was placing the last plate on the counter when she felt it, a heat at her back, too close. Her breath hitched. "You're a perfect hostess," Carter murmured, voice smooth, rich with amusement. "I feel so at home here." His fingers grazed the fabric of her dress, brushing against the small of her back. The touch was fleeting, barely there, but intentional. Eleanor froze. A cold wave of nausea rolled through her stomach, but she didn't move, couldn't. She wasn't sure if it was fear that kept her still or the raw, paralyzing rage building inside her. He was testing her, waiting to see if she'd react. She forced herself to take a slow breath. Don't give him what he wants. With a controlled movement, she stepped away, putting the counter between them. She turned slowly, lifting her chin. "Don't show fear." Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, measured. "I think you should go back to the table," she said. Carter didn't move. His smirk deepened. "What's the rush?" She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Dessert is ready." "Dessert can wait." His voice was low, intimate, like a secret shared between lovers. Her stomach churned. "I think you've had enough to drink," Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, Elena!" Her name on his lips made her skin crawl. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. She wanted to yell, to scream, but Daniel was still outside, still out of reach. And Carter? Carter knew that. He took a slow step forward, placing his hands on the counter, caging her in without ever touching her. His breath was warm against her cheek. "I have to ask," he murmured, his voice almost teasing. She clenched her fists. "Don't react. Don't react. Does Daniel really satisfy you?" The words sent ice through her veins. Her breath caught. For a moment the room blurred. She had heard men like him before, seen their kind in passing glances, in unwelcome smiles, in hands that lingered, but never in her own home. Never like this. Anger ignited in her chest, white hot and dangerous. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze, her voice sharp enough to cut. "You should leave." Carter tilted his head, grinning like she had just entertained him. "Relax," he said, amusement thick in his tone. "It's just a little fun." His hand brushed against her waist, a touch so light it could be dismissed. But she wouldn't dismiss it. She wouldn't. Elena slapped his hand away, her voice harder now. "I said, leave." Silence. For the first time that night, Carter's smirk flickered just for a second, a thin crack in his confidence. Elena stood taller, her breath coming fast, her rage giving her strength. She would not be intimidated in her own home. She stared him down, unflinching, as if daring him to push further. Let him. Carter exhaled a slow breath, watching her. Then he smiled. Not an apology, not regret, but something else, something worse. He took a lazy step back, lifting his hands in mock surrender. "You're feisty." Eleanor didn't respond. She had nothing left to say. Just then Daniel's voice echoed from the hall. "Sorry, that was my boss." Daniel stepped back into the room, eyes flicking between them, oblivious to what had just happened. Carter, always the actor, turned back to the counter, picking up his glass with a relaxed smile. "Daniel, your wife has quite the temper," he joked, shaking his head. "I like that." Daniel laughed. Eleanor felt sick. She looked at Daniel, waiting, hoping for something, for him to see. But he didn't. He just poured Carter another drink. And in that moment, she knew. She was alone in this. The air in the dining room had thickened, weighed down by the unspoken battle unfolding beneath the surface. The ice in Mr. Carter's glass had long since melted, but his stare, sharp and predatory, remained unchanged. He was done pretending. Elena sat rigid in her chair, her hands clenched beneath the table, her nails digging into her palm as she fought against the helplessness crawling up her throat. Daniel was oblivious, too wrapped up in Carter's attention to notice the slow unravelling of his wife right in front of him. And then it happened. Mr. Carter lifted his glass, his smirk widening. "A toast," he said, his voice thick with amusement, whiskey dripping from his tongue like honey laced with poison. Daniel, eager to please, raised his own glass. "To what?" he asked, chuckling as if he was part of some inside joke. Carter's eyes never left Eleanor. "To beautiful company," he said smoothly, tilting his glass in her direction. Eleanor's skin prickled. Daniel laughed, completely blind to the weight of those words, the way Carter's gaze pinned her down like prey caught in a snare. She didn't lift her glass. Carter noticed. His smirk didn't falter, but something in his expression shifted. Subtle, dangerous, a silent warning. Elena swallowed hard, a war raging in her chest. She had endured enough, endured his lingering touches, his suffocating presence, the quiet humiliation of being cornered in her own home. And yet, she could feel it. The moment was coming, the moment where this silent war would either end or explode. Daniel excused himself, laughing at something Carter had said, his voice disappearing down the hall as he stepped into the washroom. The air shifted immediately. Elena felt it before she saw it. Carter stood. Not fast, not urgent. Slow, measured. He moved around the table, his footsteps steady, deliberate as he closed the distance between them. Elena's heart pounded. She could still feel the ghosts of his previous touches on her skin. The way his hand had lingered too long, the way his breath had brushed against her ear when he whispered things she didn't want to hear. This time, he didn't pretend it was accidental. This time, he didn't wait. His fingers wrapped around her wrist, firm, unyielding. She froze. The room shrank, the walls pressing in, the warmth of the chandelier lights now suffocating. "Don't be shy," Carter murmured, his grip tightening slightly. Elena's breath hitched. The contact sent a surge of nausea through her veins, a sickening mixture of rage and fear twisting inside her. Not here, not now, not again. She forced herself to meet his eyes, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Let go," she said. Her voice was stronger than she expected, but Carter only smirked, his fingers pressing deeper into her skin. A sick amusement flickered in his gaze, as if he enjoyed this. The power, the thrill of control, the knowledge that Daniel wasn't here to see it. And that's when it snapped. The fear broke. The silence shattered. The anger took over. Without thinking, without hesitation, Elena acted. She yanked her arm back and reached blindly for the nearest object, her fingers curled around a glass of water. Before she could second-guess herself, before she could talk herself down, she lifted it and threw it. The cold water splashed across Carter's face, drenching his expensive suit, droplets clinging to his stunned expression. A second of silence, a single heartbeat where the world stood still. Then he stumbled back, a sharp inhale, a flicker of shock, and then laughter. Carter wiped his face, his shoulders shaking with amusement. He was laughing, like this was funny, like she was the entertainment. Eleanor's hands trembled at her sides, her breathing uneven. Her chest rose and fell with rapid, angry breaths, her pulse a wild storm inside her veins. She didn't regret it, not for a second, but it wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough to erase the way he had looked at her, the way he had made her feel small, the way he had dared to touch her and act as if he could get away with it. The worst part, he could. Because Daniel walked in at the wrong moment, his brows furrowed as he took in the scene, the water on the floor, the damp stain on Carter's shirt, the laughter in Carter's throat, and the fury in his wife's eyes. "What's going on?" Daniel asked, confused. Eleanor turned to him, her chest still rising and falling with the force of her anger. Her eyes screamed the words she wanted to say. "Do you see it now? Do you see what he's done? Do you finally understand?" But Carter was always 2 steps ahead. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he dabbed at his shirt with a napkin, chuckling under his breath like this was nothing more than a joke at her expense. "Your wife's got a temper," he said smoothly, his voice tinged with amusement. Daniel hesitated, his eyes flicked between them, confusion clouding his expression. And then he laughed, a nervous, unsure chuckle, like he wasn't sure how to react. Like he was waiting for permission from his boss to decide whether this was something to be upset about. And in that moment, something inside Eleanor snapped so completely, so irreversibly that she knew she could never go back. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something she could explain away, because Daniel had seen the scene in front of him, and he had still chosen not to see. He had still chosen Carter. Eleanor stepped back, her body numb, her mind eerily quiet. Carter smirked at her one last time as if he had won. And maybe, in some twisted way, he had, because she wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even afraid. She was just done. Done with Daniel's blindness. Done with the silence. Done with pretending. Her fingers itched to grab her purse, to walk out that door, to leave behind the weight of a marriage that had let this happen. But she knew the reckoning was coming. And when it did, Carter wouldn't be the one laughing anymore. Elena's hands trembled, her body still pulsing with the aftershocks of rage and humiliation. The room was spinning, her thoughts colliding, crashing against each other like waves in a storm. Carter was still laughing, not a nervous laugh, not an embarrassed one, but a victorious one. As if this was all some twisted game and she had played right into his hands. He pushed his chair back with ease, standing, stretching like a man who had enjoyed a long, satisfying meal. His shirt was still damp from the water she had thrown at him, but he didn't seem to care. If anything, he looked amused. He reached for his coat, sliding it on with practiced arrogance before turning back to her. "Thanks for the hospitality," he said, his voice low, teasing. And then he winked. Elena's stomach churned. Something inside her cracked open, raw and bleeding, but she forced herself to stay still, to keep her face blank. Do not give him the satisfaction. Carter glanced at Daniel, who stood stiffly by the table, watching the scene unfold like an outsider to his own life. The hesitation in his eyes made Eleanor's skin crawl. Would he do something? Say something? Would he finally see what had been in front of him all night? Would he finally choose her? Carter smirked. Of course not. With one last glance in her direction, Carter stepped toward the door, his shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. Then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him. Silence. For a brief moment, Elena allowed herself to breathe, to let the poison of his presence leave the air. And then, "Elena, why would you do that?" She turned slowly, her heart lurching in her chest as she stared at Daniel, who stood there, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. Frustration. Not anger at Carter, not concern for her, but frustration at her. The betrayal was like a slap to the face. Elena let out a shaky breath, trying to process, trying to make sense of it. "Are you seriously asking me that?" she whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair, avoiding her gaze. Elena, he's my boss. His boss. That was all he had to say. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask what had happened when he left the room. He didn't even look at the evidence, at the way her hands were still shaking, at the way her body was still locked in fight or flight mode. All he saw was Carter and his job. You need this job, Elena repeated, tasting the words on her tongue like acid. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his forehead. I mean, look, I get that he was a little much, but you shouldn't have... A little much. The room blurred for a second, her vision tunneling as the weight of it all came crashing down. He didn't get it. He would never get it. Carter could have done anything, could have cornered her in their own home, could have held her down, could have made her feel smaller than she had ever felt before. And Daniel still wouldn't have seen it, still wouldn't have chosen her. The thought stilled her. A chilling calm settled over her skin, spreading through her veins like ice. She realized in that moment that it didn't matter how much she screamed, how much she cried, how much she begged to be seen. Daniel was blind by choice, and she was done trying to make him see. The house suddenly felt suffocating, the air too thick, too heavy. She turned away from him, walking toward the bedroom. Daniel followed. Elena? She didn't respond. She didn't need to. She reached for the closet, pulling out a small suitcase, flipping it open with calm precision. Daniel frowned. What are you doing? She grabbed a handful of clothes, tossing them inside. Packing. His breath caught. Packing for what? Elena turned to face him, really face him, for the first time that night. Her voice was eerily quiet, steady, final. For somewhere I don't have to be afraid in my own home. Daniel's lips parted slightly, his shoulders stiffening as the weight of her words finally started to sink in. He blinked, stepping forward, reaching for her arm. Elena, come on, don't be like this. She flinched back before he could touch her, not out of fear, but because it was too late for his touch to matter now. She zipped up the suitcase and pulled it off the bed, brushing past him. Elena, please, let's talk. She stopped at the doorway, tilting her head just enough to look at him one last time. You had a choice. Her voice didn't waver. Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his expression shifting, conflicted, uncertain. But it didn't matter anymore, because when the moment had come, he had chosen wrong. Without another word, Eleanor stepped out of the bedroom, walked through the hallway, and reached the front door. Her fingers curled around the handle. She took a deep breath. And then she opened it. The night air rushed against her skin, cold and crisp, but it felt cleaner than anything inside that house. She stepped outside, letting the weight fall from her shoulders. Behind her, Daniel's voice called out, desperate, regretful. Elena! She didn't turn back. She didn't stop. She didn't cry. She kept walking. For the first time that night, for the first time in a long time, she was free.